This is absolutely fascinating one to me. This is out of Minneapolis, I think, and it's starting to get national recognition. Although I have no idea why it's happening just today when they're going to vote on this tomorrow. But this measure is basically, when we talk about defund the police, this is a defund the police basically measure in Minneapolis. Remember, Minneapolis is where George Floyd died. The people were outraged. Legislatures were outraged by this. A whole study was done about how bad the Minneapolis Police Department has been and was. So the call to defund the police began in Minnesota, and it went throughout the nation. Of course, right-wing Democrats, as I'll call them, they are not moderates, they're right-wingers, blamed the losses in the U.S. Senate to defund the police, which is just like, give me a break. Don't even get me started. Anyway, Minneapolis, it looked like had been getting kind of squishy on this issue. Am I turning a little bit more blue? It looked like they had been kind of squishy on this issue. So it appears as if they are really still going forward with this, and they are really going to continue to work this whole thing. I'm looking a little bit blue, so I'm just changing this a little bit, but doesn't seem to be doing anything. The filter on the camera, I think, is changing. So what's happened, and I'm going to go straight to this video, but this question number 2 says it would replace the Minneapolis Police Department with a new Department of Public Safety, DPS. The DPS would be responsible for comprehensive public health approach to safety, including the employment of licensed police officers if needed to fulfill the department's responsibility. So this is going to be the nation's first test. If this proposition goes through, it'll be the nation's first test of what it looks like to quote unquote defund the police and create a new system for policing in Minneapolis. This could be incredible or it could be very scary. And of course, Republicans are going to scaremonger over this kind of stuff, particularly if crime goes up. People are going to just lose their minds about how, outrageous this is. But I'm going to play this video. This is from a local, and there are actually 2 videos. I want to play the second video from CBS. They're new, but it's 11 minutes long. It's really long. But this is a really, really important issue that I think really needs to be discussed and talked about. But so this is the shorter video. I'm going to play this video so that we can know what this question really is, what it's all about from a local point of view, because it has a very interesting thing. And I think the first thing that you'll see is the chief of police is stepping down, it looks like, in Minneapolis over this whole issue because they're so, police are so outraged by this.
Also spent a lot of time with impassioned sarcasm. MPD Chief Madera Arredondo voiced the biggest concern from the vote no on question 2 crowd.
And again, I was not expecting some sort of robust, detailed word-for-word plan. But at this point, quite frankly, I would take a drawing on a napkin. And I've not seen either.
Here's an example of what a department org chart could look like.
But in May, City Council members gave an outline of a plan for a new Department of Public Safety to replace the Minneapolis Police Department, including a department organizational chart, a vision, and some specifics on how police officers would no longer respond to certain 911 calls.
We will create alternative responses to emergency calls that produce better outcomes, as we are already doing this year with mental health response and report-only calls.
Councilmember Steve Fletcher said many more specifics would come over the summer when the City Council would craft an ordinance that defines the actual department.
And we'll work in public to create a clear outline of the ordinance that will enact the charter language so that voters can really see what they're voting for.
That ordinance, Fletcher said, would let voters really see what they're voting for, was never created.
I'm going to be sending some legal advice.
After City Ethics Officer Susan Trammell stepped in.
I want to caution this group that using city resources to generate support for a charter amendment could be viewed as a violation of the prohibition against using city resources for ballot question support.
Trammell said city officials could use resources to educate and explain differences between things on the ballot, but not to promote either side.
Well, one thing that is important to point out is that council members did not lay out plan specifics as part of their individual campaigns either, which they would have been allowed to do without using city resources. But none of them did that either. Now, supporters say the work to implement ideas can begin, and if and when the measure passes, while opponents say there is too much unknown to make such a change to the city charter.
Happening today, a little more than 4 months after Derek Chauvin was sent to prison for the murder of George Floyd.
All right, I'm going to move on because I want to go to, that's actually an interesting piece that was coming up next regarding the jurors speaking, the Chauvin jurors. I'm going to play a little bit of this CBSN piece here. It goes into more detail on this particular proposal of a new police department, and I think this is so important an issue that I want to spend more time. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to spend a little bit more time taking a look at this and going over it a little bit more, because this, again, like I said, this could be a template going forward, or it could be, the canary in the coal mine. This does not actually, I think what this does is it's a proposal to replace, and I think that there would be more work that needs to be done. I don't think that if this thing passed, it would be over and done with. But it is a first crack at this. And, Democrats and other groups can begin to use this whole thing going forward to create what it is that needs to happen across this country when we talk about defund the police. So I'm really fascinated about this, so I'm going to indulge me a little bit. I'm going to play this other piece. It's 11 minutes long. I may cut in early to move on, but I want to hear a little bit about this.
The mayoral election is just days away in Minneapolis, and more than a dozen people are vying for the city's top spot. 4 of the frontrunners took part in a debate earlier this week. The topic of police reform took center stage, with crime on the rise in the city. In this election, voters will not only decide on who will be mayor, but also if the police force should be replaced with a public safety agency. Joining us now to talk more about that debate and the candidates is CBSN Minnesota political reporter Caroline Cummings. Caroline, thank you very much for joining us. You were one of the moderators of this debate. What stood out to you?
Good morning, guys. Thanks so much for having me. So the debate really is centered on that policing issue. And I think that that's what stood out to me the most, is that these top 4 contenders for mayor, Sheila Najad, Kate Knuth, AJ Awed, and incumbent mayor Jacob Fry, are really divided on the police question. Jacob Fry and AJ Awed are against the police ballot question, while Sheila Najad and Kate Knuth are supportive of it, saying that we need to overhaul policing and kind of start over. So those 4 being so divided on the issue is kind of illustrative of what the city is facing right now, the people who want to perhaps keep the police department and reform it as it is, and those who say that, like I said, need to start all over. Also, incumbent mayor Jacob Fry took a lot of attacks from his opponents, and naturally an incumbent would, but he's in an interesting position because he's been the mayor over the time of unrest and George Floyd's murder. He was the leader of the police department during that time, and also the pandemic that happened concurrently. So it's an interesting state of affairs, right? It's a kind of a little bit of a anyone but Jacob Fry, so some of the opponents say, whereas the opponents and the candidates themselves are divided on the police ballot issue, which might be a wedge issue for some voters.
So let us talk about that hot button issue. It's a ballot question number 2. And it asks if the city's police force should be replaced with a Department of Public Service, a Department of Public Safety department. So listen, you mentioned that candidates are sort of split on that. I want to play some sound.
I favor a both-and approach, which means yes, deep-seated accountability. Yes, a full structure change, safety beyond policing, and importantly, we also need police. And right now we have fewer officers per capita than just about any major city in the entire country.
If you want to de-escalate a gathering, make sure people have a place to go, to the bathroom. And that's how we create spaces where people can breathe together, right? I would also provide free counseling in park buildings and schools across the city.
The first priority for the next mayor, any mayor, should be getting more officers out on the streets. And that's exactly what I plan to do. And the reason why I think I'm the best person suited to do that job is because I think I have the credibility in communities of color to really have them be empowered to raise their hands. Also really enlist people to, be in service for community.
I have put forward a bold, courageous plan to transform policing and build community safety. And I think Minneapolis voters should really be focused on the record of the last 4 years, and especially the last year and a half, where Mayor Fry has literally seen officers hunting people in our city and has not yet created accountability within the MPD.
All right, so the wording of this question was kind of hotly debated. And, as I'm looking at sort of the media coverage and, the way people read nowadays, often they read the headline and they don't read the body, and you see, defund the police or voters will have to decide whether or not to replace the police department. And I'm wondering, are voters clear on what this measure means? And it also sounds like, it's one thing to vote yes or no on it, but the practical working, the way it will actually work out in the city, I suppose that still needs to be hashed out. So do voters know actually what they're voting for or against?
So opponents would argue that the language is anything but clear, and that's why this very question and the language surrounding the question ended up in court. But ultimately, what's on the ballot for voters on Tuesday and those who've already voted in early voting was approved or said okay by the state Supreme Court. So the question stands. Now, to the point about what they're voting on. So the question makes no mention of defund the police, though the defund the police argument perhaps started here in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered last summer. It would replace the current police department with a Department of Public Safety that supporters of the amendment say would basically just take a bigger, more holistic, comprehensive public safety approach that involves a public health approach, in their words, to public safety. Now, the actual plan of what that Department of Public Safety looks like will be in the works if this should pass. There was a city memo sent out about kind of what does Minneapolis look like on November 3rd, should this amendment get passed. And it's clear that the police will still have their jobs, and that this charter language, so what we're talking about is changing basically the city's constitution to remove the police department and the requirement to have a certain amount of officers relative to the population. This amendment would take that language out and in turn replace it with this Department of Public Safety, which supporters and the language says could include police officers. We just don't know what that might look like. And at least on November 3rd, should this pass, police officers would still have their jobs, and that this actual language to the city charter, that's the nexus of the heart of the amendment, wouldn't take effect for 30 days. So there's kind of that window to hash out more of those details.
So I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think that one of the things that it's going to expose is how many black people are for the police. I think a lot of people just assume that, particularly given George Floyd and particularly given, all of the other killings that have happened, that black people are not for the police. There are a lot of black people that are for the police. They actually want a very strong police department. So this is not by any means a gimme as far as defunding the police and getting rid of the police. So particularly older blacks, people from other countries that come here, it's going to be very interesting. I have a feeling that's going to be a nail biter. That's going to be very close. But, you know, it is an opportunity because, you know, I don't know if the New York Times had did a piece. I might take a look. But Minneapolis Police Department, a whole investigation was done, and they were like terrible. So, and we know that in New Jersey, there was a city where the whole police department was overhauled. It was so crime ridden and all this kind of stuff. They put in all this police, and the crime kept going up Camden, and they went in and just did a total overhaul of the whole system, redid it from the ground up, and it's now some of the lowest crime. So this thing works if done right.